On the night of the celebration, the usher looked straight into my eyes and said, cold as stone, "You'll have to wait outside." The words landed sharper than if he had shouted. The doors to the hall, bright, polished, alive with music and laughter, closed in front of me, not with a slam, but with a careful, final push, as though sealing me out was a duty, not an insult. Still, it felt like a verdict. For a moment, I stood staring at the grain of the wood, hearing the muffled echoes of voices on the other side, realizing that inside was life, light, belonging, while I was left in the cold, a shadow erased from the picture. It is strange how quickly dignity can be stripped away. A single gesture, a single refusal, and years of work, presence, memory are reduced to nothing. The hall is full, he had said, but it was not about space, it was about worth. In his eyes, I was not one of the people who mattered, not someone to be welcomed, just an old man to be managed, moved out of the way, kept invisible so that the night could shine for others. The air outside was colder than I had expected. It pressed against me, sharp and unkind, and in that chill I felt the honesty that people so often avoid. The truth that sometimes the ones who should welcome you are the first to discard you. Inside, I imagined them settling into their seats, the host preparing to take the stage, the chatter rising and falling like a tide. And me? I was left staring at a locked door, my reflection faint in the glass, unwanted, unseen. I thought of everything that had led to this night, of the times I had given my strength when others refused to lift a hand, of the projects I had carried to completion, the nights of labor that no one remembered, but which had built the very stage they now occupied. My mind rebelled against the insult, reminding me that I had been part of the foundation. Yet rebellion did not erase the sting. It burned inside me, twisting into shame, because what use are memories of sacrifice when the present shuts the door in your face? People passed by me in the lobby, some with hurried steps, some with eyes that slid away, unwilling to meet mine. They knew. They saw the injustice, but no one wanted to be the one to say, "Let him in." Silence was safer. And so I remained outside, not because there was no place for me, but because no one had the courage to make space. The door between us was not just wood and hinges. It was a wall between who they believed was important and who they believed was expendable. And in that moment, I was branded as the latter. But as I stood there, my breath clouding in the cold air, I felt something stir beneath the sting. Not anger, not yet, not vengeance, something quieter, steadier. A voice that whispered, "This is not the end. The truth will not stay outside forever." And though the door had closed on me that night, I knew, deep inside, that another door was waiting to open. One they would not be able to shut again. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever had a moment in life when a door, literal or not, was closed in your face? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to life. And now, we continue. The threshold became more than wood and stone that night. It became a line of exile. I stood on one side of it in the chill of the lobby, while on the other side life unfolded without me. Through the door came muffled music, bursts of laughter, the rhythm of a gathering that was meant to bring people together. Yet I was held apart, as though belonging was a luxury I had not earned. Time slowed in that place. Minutes stretched into hours, though the clock moved no differently than before. Waiting has a way of enlarging questions until they press against the ribs, suffocating you from the inside. Who am I to them? A burden? An inconvenience? A shadow taking up space they would rather give to someone else? Each thought grew heavier as the air cooled around me, settling like frost on my skin. I leaned on my cane, staring at the threshold I was not allowed to cross. That narrow strip of floor mocked me. Just a step, one small step, and I would be inside. Warmth instead of cold, light instead of shadows, dignity instead of shame. But the permission was not mine to give. Others had decided I was to wait, and their decision had the power of chains. People came and went around me. Guests hurried in, showing passes, smiling at the ushers. Some glanced at me quickly and then looked away, ashamed of what they saw, but not ashamed enough to change it. Others walked past without a flicker of recognition, as though I were invisible. In their silence, I heard their judgment. He is no one. He does not belong in the front rows. He belongs here, outside, waiting, forgotten. And I stood there, motionless. Yet inside everything churned. Memories collided with questions. I thought of the years when I had given everything I had to ensure this event, this community, this gathering, could even exist. My sweat had helped build it. My hands had carried its burdens. My sacrifices had shaped its foundation. Yet here I was, treated as if I were nothing more than clutter in the hallway. The weight of it pressed harder with each passing second. Doubt slid in like a shadow. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am no longer needed. Maybe my place is not inside anymore. But another voice, deeper and quieter, whispered back, "No." They may have forgotten, but truth does not die in silence. You are not an empty chair. You are not a mistake. You are the reason the hall stands at all. Still, the longer I waited, the more the threshold seemed like a wall that would never open. The line between inside and outside had never felt so sharp, and though no chains bound me, I felt imprisoned by the cold, by the glances, by the absence of anyone willing to speak my name. In that moment, the weight of the threshold was not just about the door, it was about my very worth. And standing there, breathing in the chill, I realized that the world had once again asked me to prove what I had already given a lifetime to show, that I belong. They began to arrive in clusters, familiar faces dressed in their best clothes, voices bright with anticipation. People I had known for years, people whose hands I had once shaken, whose burdens I had once carried, whose paths had once crossed mine when they needed help. I recognized them instantly, and yet, when their eyes met mine for the briefest of moments, they looked away. It was not hostility that hurt. It was avoidance. The kind of avoidance that says, "I see you, but I don't want to admit that I do." They adjusted their jackets, fiddled with their purses, greeted the ushers with laughter. Anything to keep from acknowledging the man standing alone by the threshold. One of them, an old colleague, walked right past me. There was a time when he would clasp my shoulder, call me friend, tell stories of the work we had done together. But now his eyes flicked toward me and then slid away like water avoiding a crack in the stone. His pace quickened, as if my presence might stain his clothes, as if recognizing me would risk his own place in the hall. Another, a neighbor who had once borrowed my tools and thanked me endlessly for the smallest kindness, glanced at me, hesitated, and then turned his head sharply as though I were a stranger. His son asked him something as they passed, and he spoke quickly, too quickly, his words tumbling out to cover the silence of his betrayal. That was the word echoing inside me. Betrayal. Not the betrayal of harsh words or cruel laughter, but of silence. The betrayal of eyes that refused to meet mine, of mouths that pretended not to see, of steps that carried them swiftly away from the discomfort of remembering. Because deep down, they did remember. They remembered what I had done, who I had been, what I had given. They remembered the times when my hands had steadied the table they now ate at, when my labor had built the walls they now stood beneath. But to acknowledge me now would be to admit their debt, their blindness, their ingratitude. And so it was easier to look away. The lobby felt colder with each passing face, not from the air, but from the absence of recognition. I was no longer a person in their eyes, only a shadow they wished would stay pressed against the wall. And as I watched them, One after another, I realized the cruelty of it. It is not strangers who wound the deepest. It is the familiar faces that choose to act like strangers. The ones who could have spoken for you, stood for you, lifted you back into the light, but chose instead to walk past with their heads lowered. I clenched the handle of my cane tighter, feeling the pulse of my heart in my hand. I did not speak, did not call out their names, did not demand what was owed. What would be the point? Recognition begged for is no recognition at all. And yet, the weight of their silence cut deeper than any insult the usher could have hurled. I had expected the coldness of strangers. I had not expected the indifference of those who once called me friend. That night, the faces that turned away branded me more deeply than any words could, and I knew with painful clarity that betrayal wears many masks. But the worst is not hatred. It is pretending not to see. I stood by the wall, pretending to adjust my coat, but really I was listening. It is strange how the human ear sharpens when dignity is at stake. Every whisper cuts through the noise of the room as if it were spoken directly into your heart. Two ushers stood near the door, their heads bent close. Their words were not meant for me, but they carried easily across the polished floor. "No bracelet, no entry," one muttered, his tone sharp, decisive. "That's the rule." The other chuckled softly, low enough to seem private, but I heard it all the same. "Don't waste time arguing with him. He's not one of the important ones. Just keep him out there." Not important. The phrase so casually dropped hit harder than the cold air that had already settled into my bones. It wasn't just about a missing bracelet. It wasn't about regulations or rules. It was about worth. To them, I was already measured, weighed, and found lacking. The verdict had been passed in whispers, but it was loud enough to echo inside me. I turned slightly, my back against the wall, my eyes lowered as if I hadn't heard. That's what they expected anyway, that I would fade into the background, silent, compliant, invisible. But the words pulsed in me like a wound that refused to close. Not important. Did they know what those words carried? Did they know the nights I had worked when no one else showed up? The times I had offered my strength when others stepped aside? The quiet sacrifices that had built the very events they now guarded so carefully? Did they realize they were standing on the work of someone they dismissed as irrelevant? Or did it not matter? Perhaps to them, memory itself was disposable, just like the man leaning against the wall outside their precious doors. I watched them laugh softly between themselves, adjusting their jackets, proud in their small power. To them, a plastic band on the wrist defined worth. A list on paper determined who mattered and who didn't. Everything else, years, sacrifice, legacy, was invisible. I wanted to speak, to tell them that worth is not measured in bracelets or tickets, that the truest weight of a person cannot be printed on a guest list. But I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of something heavier, exhaustion. There comes a point when explaining yourself to the blind feels like shouting into the wind. Still, their whispers lingered, louder than the laughter echoing from inside. They had reduced me to an inconvenience, a shadow, someone unworthy of space in a hall that would not even exist if not for the countless unseen hands that came before. I pressed my palm against my cane, steadying myself. The wood creaked faintly under the pressure, as if it too shared the weight of my silence. And in that silence, I felt the sting of their dismissal transform into something else. Not rage, not yet, but a growing certainty that the truth has a way of stepping into the light, no matter how many doors are shut against it. Because what they whispered in mockery tonight would one day be drowned out by voices they could not silence. And when that day came, the same mouths that laughed would fall silent. As I leaned against the cold wall of the lobby, their whispers still gnawing at me, memories began to rise, unbidden. They did not come gently. They flooded in, sharp and alive, as if the past itself refused to let me believe the lie of not important. I saw myself, years ago, long before my hair had turned white, before my body bent under the weight of time. I was there on nights when others had gone home, when deadlines loomed like storms and everyone else abandoned ship. I stayed. I remember the bitter taste of cheap coffee keeping me awake at 3 in the morning, the ache in my back from bending over papers, plans, broken equipment, unfinished scripts, whatever needed saving. I remember telling myself, just one more hour, just hold it together until the dawn. And I did. I saw the scenes again, the ones that nearly collapsed under the weight of poor planning or empty funding. The events people now celebrated as triumphs, the traditions they claimed with pride, had nearly died more than once. And each time, when panic swept through the team, it was my hands that steadied the foundation. My voice, quiet but firm, had pulled them back from the edge. My hours of work, invisible in the final product, had stitched the fabric together so that others could shine beneath the lights. There was one night in particular I could never forget. The stage had been unfinished, the electricians long gone, the clock ticking down to morning. Everyone said it couldn't be done. I stayed until my hands bled, hammering boards, tightening bolts, running wires in the dark with nothing but a flashlight and stubbornness. At dawn, when the curtains rose, no one knew how close it had come to disaster. They only saw the polished show, the applause, the host smiling beneath flawless lights. No one clapped for me. No one remembered. But the hall had stood because I refused to let it fall. And then another memory. The year a keynote speaker canceled at the last moment. Chaos rippled through the staff, panic in their eyes, guests already arriving. I made the calls, I found a replacement, I pieced together a program from scraps. And when the host stepped out that night, the audience never suspected a thing. They applauded, unaware that behind the curtain one man had held the broken strings together long enough to make the show go on. These memories, vivid as the cold air filling my lungs, reminded me of what I had given. The hall, the event, the very ceremony now underway, it all stood on invisible scaffolding of sacrifices like mine. Yet here I was, left outside as if I had done nothing, as if my years of carrying weight meant less than a plastic bracelet on a wrist. I pressed my eyes shut, the sting of betrayal cutting deep, not because strangers failed to see me, but because those who owed me their memories chose to forget. They danced in the light I had once protected, while I stood alone in the shadows. But the past would not lie. It rose inside me, fierce and insistent, telling me that I was not what they believed, that my worth was not erased by their silence, that though the world may have turned its back, the truth of my labor still stood, solid and undeniable. And so, even as shame pricked at me, even as whispers branded me unimportant, my memories burned hotter. They reminded me of something the ushers, the administrators, the crowd inside had forgotten. Halls may be filled with applause, but it is sacrifice in the dark that makes them possible. And one day, sacrifice always finds its light. At last, I gathered myself and approached the ushers. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of being forced to defend what should never have been questioned. I explained who I was, the role I had once played, the years I had given when this stage and this very ceremony had needed saving hands. My words came measured, steady, not pleading but reminding them that my presence was not an accident, not a whim, but a right earned in sweat and sleepless nights. They listened without listening. Their eyes flicked past me to the next guest in line, to the list in their hands, to the glint of plastic bracelets that determined worth. One of them gave me a polite smile, so thin it cut deeper than cruelty. "I'm sorry, sir. Rules are rules. Without a pass, without a bracelet, we can't let you in." Rules. How many times had I bent the rules of exhaustion, of budget, of time itself to keep these events alive? How many times had I been the reason rules could even exist, because without me, the show would have collapsed long before anyone cared about bracelets. Yet here I stood, my entire life measured against a strip of plastic. I tried again, a little firmer. "Check your records. My name will be there. Look again." But the usher didn't even move his eyes toward the list. He had already decided what I was: an interruption, an inconvenience, not worth the effort of turning a page. "We can't make exceptions," he repeated, his voice mechanical, as if I were nothing more than static in his evening. And with that, the conversation ended. My words, my years, my sacrifices, all dissolved into the air like smoke. The only thing that mattered to them was the absence of plastic on my wrist. That small, meaningless band had become the judge of my worth, more powerful than history, more powerful than memory. I stepped back, the humiliation sharp and choking. The lobby air smelled of wet coats and burnt coffee drifting from a nearby machine. The ordinary scent of it wrapped around me like mockery, reminding me of how small they thought I was. I could feel the eyes of strangers brushing over me, curious, indifferent, dismissive. No one stepped forward. No one questioned why a man like me was being pushed aside. The world prefers comfort, and comfort lives in silence. I leaned once more against my cane, my breath fogging in the cool air. Inside, music swelled, voices lifted in cheer, the ceremony pressing forward without me. Outside, I stood with nothing but the sting of rejection, burning hotter than the coffee's bitter smell. I had asked only for recognition of who I already was. But here, stripped down to their rules, I was no longer a man. I was a mistake without a bracelet, a shadow not worth a seat. And yet, beneath the weight of that shame, a defiance grew, not loud, not vengeful, but steady. Because I knew what they did not. Plastic could dictate doors, but it could not dictate truth. And the truth, my truth, was still waiting to step inside. I had nearly given up speaking when I saw him. A familiar face in the crowd, one I had known for years, someone who had once leaned on me when his own projects faltered, someone who had sat in my kitchen late at night, pouring out his worries while I steadied him with advice and encouragement. A man who knew, better than most, what I had given. Our eyes met. For a brief moment I felt the flicker of hope, the faint relief that perhaps I would not have to stand alone in this humiliation. He could vouch for me. He could speak a single sentence and the ushers would step aside. He could confirm that I belonged not in the shadows of the lobby but inside, among the rows of seats where my presence had been earned. But instead, he looked away. His gaze dropped quickly, almost guiltily, as though the recognition of my face were dangerous. His pace quickened. I watched his jaw tighten, his shoulders stiffen, his whole body broadcasting a single message: "Don't involve me." He walked past without a word, as though he hadn't seen me at all, as though I were just another old man loitering at the door. That silence was worse than any insult. From the ushers, I expected dismissal. From strangers, indifference was nothing new. But from him, from someone who knew, someone who remembered, that silence cut deeper than all the others combined. Because it wasn't ignorance that made him look away. It was choice. I understood what lived behind his silence: calculation. To defend me would mean confrontation. It would mean stepping out of line, risking his own place, creating discomfort. To him, it was easier to pretend not to see, to let me bear the shame alone rather than share even a fraction of it. His silence wasn't absence. It was self-preservation, cloaked in cowardice. For a moment, rage flared inside me. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet fury of betrayal. I thought of the nights I had helped him, the times I had spoken up for him when others doubted his worth, the hours I had given when he had nothing to give back. And now, when my dignity trembled in the balance, he could not spare even a single word.
The lobby felt colder than ever, though the air had not changed. It was the cold of realization that sometimes the people who could help the most will choose instead to vanish, to look away, to pretend they do not see your need, and their silence, more than mockery, more than rejection, becomes the loudest voice of all.
I watched him disappear into the hall, swallowed by warmth and laughter, and I remained outside, left with the taste of betrayal bitter on my tongue, my cane pressed harder into the floor, my hand aching from the strain. I told myself not to break beneath it, not to let his silence become my truth. But the wound was real, raw, undeniable, because sometimes the cruelest words are the ones never spoken. Time dragged on in the lobby, each passing minute pressing heavier against me, when I noticed the murmurs. The doors to the hall were still closed, but sound leaked through. The shifting of chairs, the restlessness of a crowd that expected the program to begin. The band had already tuned their instruments. The lights had been tested. The stage stood ready. Everything inside was prepared for celebration. And yet, nothing started. I could hear the voices ripple, uneven and impatient. Someone coughed, another whispered. The hum of anticipation, which should have risen into applause by now, remained suspended, like an orchestra frozen with bows lifted, but no conductor's signal. It was as if the whole event was caught in a strange, invisible grip, held still by something unnamed. I pictured the stage. I had stood there once before, years ago, when the hall was nothing more than bare wood and scaffolding, when the lights flickered uncertainly and the curtains still smelled of new cloth. Back then, the air had also been heavy with expectation. But then, the weight had been mine alone. The burden of pulling everything together so that others could step into the spotlight. Tonight, that spotlight waited for someone else. But it would not shine. Not yet. The ushers shifted uneasily near me, exchanging glances. Even they sensed it. The schedule was broken. The rhythm lost. Guests inside began to murmur louder, wondering why the ceremony hadn't begun. From the outside, I could feel the tension pressing like heat against the closed doors, as though the entire hall was inhaling but refusing to exhale. It struck me then, the irony of it. I had been cast aside, told to wait outside like an afterthought, branded unimportant. And yet, without me, even the celebration faltered. The night could not move forward. The air itself seemed to know I was missing. I leaned heavier on my cane, my breath slow, my heart caught between bitterness and a strange, trembling hope. Perhaps this pause was only coincidence, a small delay, the kind that happens at any event. But in my soul I felt it deeper. It was as if justice had placed its hand over the hall, whispering, "Not yet. Not until the forgotten one takes his place." Inside, the voices grew restless. The lights blazed hotter, waiting for a moment that refused to arrive. And outside, I stood in the cold, watching as the night itself seemed to halt, as though it knew something the people did not. The ceremony could not begin. Not yet. The silence inside deepened until it became unbearable, the kind of silence that makes every cough, every shuffle of feet echo like thunder. Then, at last, I heard footsteps across the stage, firm, deliberate, the kind of steps that belong not to someone filling time, but to someone who knew exactly what they were about to do. The host appeared, moving out from behind the curtain. His suit was sharp, his presence commanding, but his eyes carried something more, a weight, a resolve that cut through the unease in the hall. He did not offer the usual pleasantries. He did not smile. He simply looked out across the room, then toward the lobby where I stood just beyond the doors. His voice came steady, not raised, yet it filled the space with an authority greater than volume. We will not begin. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. One person is missing. Until they are here, there will be no ceremony. A wave of whispers tore through the hall. Confusion. Curiosity. Who could be so important that the host himself would hold back an entire event? Names were guessed, faces turned. Parents leaned toward their children. Teachers whispered to one another. But the host did not explain further. He simply folded his hands, waiting, as if daring anyone to challenge him. From where I stood in the lobby, the words struck like a bolt of fire through the cold. For a moment I thought I had misheard. Me? Could it be me he was speaking of? No one had called my name yet, but I felt the weight of his gaze, steady and unwavering, resting in the space where I stood outside the doors. The ushers glanced at one another, unease settling over them. They had dismissed me as irrelevant, but now the master of the stage, the very voice the evening belonged to, was halting everything for someone not in the room. Their lips tightened, their faces pale. The certainty with which they had told me rules are rules crumbled beneath the host's defiance. The hall waited, breaths held, the tension growing. I clutched the handle of my cane tighter, my heart pounding against my ribs. The humiliation of standing outside still burned, but now, beneath it, something else stirred, something long buried. A recognition that perhaps the truth I had carried silently all these years was finally being called out into the open. Inside, the host did not move, did not falter. He repeated once more, his voice calm but unyielding, "We will not begin until he is here." And in that moment, I understood. The night that had tried to erase me would not move forward without me. The doors that had closed in my face were no longer strong enough to hold back the truth. Justice had stepped onto the stage, and it was waiting for me. The host lifted his head, and the silence in the hall bent toward him like a bowstring drawn tight. His eyes swept the crowd, then fixed on the space just beyond the doors where I stood in the shadows of the lobby. And then, with a voice steady, clear, and unshakable, he spoke my name. It rang out across the hall like a bell. No hesitation, no question, only certainty. My name. The same name that had been ignored, dismissed, even mocked, now carried with it the authority of the man who held the room in his hand. The sound rippled through the crowd. First came a hush, as if the room needed to confirm what it had just heard. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, like leaves stirred by a faint wind. But quickly they grew louder, spreading from row to row, building into a wave of shock and recognition. Did he say, "It's him"? He's the one? I saw heads turn toward the lobby, eyes widening. Students craned their necks, parents leaned forward in their seats. Even teachers exchanged startled glances. They knew my name. Many of them had heard it before, but not in years, not attached to honor or reverence. Now, suddenly, it was spoken with weight, with importance, and they understood at once the gravity of what had been done. That the man the host demanded was the very man they had left standing outside, denied a seat, branded unworthy. The ushers near me stiffened, their faces paling as the truth dawned. The man they had shooed away, the one they had whispered about with contempt, the one they had forced into the cold, was the one the event could not begin without. Their earlier confidence shattered, leaving only shame and fear in its place. I felt the power of the moment pulse through me. My name, was no longer a discarded echo, but a banner carried into the air for all to hear. For so long I had lived in silence, my worth hidden in shadows, my sacrifices erased by indifference. But now, spoken aloud before hundreds, my identity was undeniable. The truth had stepped forward, and no one could push it back behind closed doors. My heart pounded, not with pride, but with vindication. Every humiliation, every whispered dismissal,
Every turned face from the lobby was being unraveled by a single sound. My name. A name they could no longer pretend not to hear. A name they could no longer erase with silence.
Inside, the whispers surged into murmurs, and murmurs into a wave of unease. Those who had looked away when I stood outside now realized the weight of their cowardice. Those who had mocked or dismissed me now sat in the presence of their own shame. Because the host had made it clear, the night would not belong to them until it belonged first to me. And in that moment, the balance shifted. The man they thought they had locked out was now the man the entire room was waiting for. The door that had been a wall moments ago opened wide with a groan, as if even its hinges felt the weight of what was happening. For so long it had been the barrier keeping me outside, the silent accomplice to humiliation. But now, suddenly, it became a passage. The cold air clung to me for an instant, then gave way to the warmth of the hall, and in that step I felt the shift, from forgotten to summoned, from rejected to required. The ushers, who only minutes earlier had barred my way with polite cruelty, stepped aside, their eyes lowered, their bodies shrinking back, as if the floor itself demanded they make room. They did not speak. What words could they offer now? The authority they had leaned on, rules, bracelets, lists, crumbled the moment my name filled the hall. Their silence was an apology they did not dare shape into sound. I took my first steps inside. The air was thick with whispers, the hum of voices rolling over me like a tide. Some tried to disguise their shock in polite clapping. Others just stared, mouths half open, as though unable to reconcile the man walking in with the one they had watched wait by the door. Students craned their necks, parents leaned sideways in their chairs, teachers folded their hands with uneasy dignity. Every face turned. The walk was long, longer than I expected. Each step echoed, not just on the polished floor, but inside me. An echo that seemed to cleanse the sting of waiting in the cold. What had been shame now became a strange kind of strength. I was not walking just to take a seat. I was walking through years of silence, through layers of dismissal, through the cowardice of those who had once looked away. Each footfall carried me further from that place of exile. I passed the rows of people who had ignored me in the lobby, the same who had rushed by earlier with eyes that pretended not to see. Now they did not look away. They couldn't. Some nodded stiffly, some lowered their gaze in shame, and others simply followed me with wide eyes, as though they had just remembered who I truly was. At the center of it all, I saw the host waiting at the front. His presence was calm, resolute. He had drawn the line in the sand, and now he stood there as though guarding the truth itself until I reached my place. His eyes met mine across the crowd, steady and unwavering, giving me the strength to keep walking when my knees trembled under the weight of so many stares. And then there was the sound that will never leave me. Not applause, not cheers, but the collective murmur of recognition, spreading like a wave through the hall. It was the sound of dignity being restored, of lies dissolving, of silence breaking at last. Every step I took carried me away from the cold outside. Not just the chill of the air, but the colder wound of being unwanted. I walked further into the warmth of truth, into the undeniable reality that they could no longer ignore me. The man who had been left outside was now the man the room had stopped for. And with each step, the distance between those two identities grew smaller, until only one remained. When I reached the front, the host extended his hand. His grip was firm, deliberate, not the shallow courtesy of someone filling a formality, but the grasp of a man acknowledging a debt that could no longer be hidden. He guided me to the first row, where a seat waited, reserved, though I had been told there was no place for me. I lowered myself into it slowly, the hall still buzzing with whispers, the heat of hundreds of eyes pressing on me from all directions. Then the host turned to the microphone. The murmurs faded at once, the air growing taut as though the whole room leaned forward. His voice, clear and steady, broke the silence. Tonight, before we begin, there is something you must understand. We could not start until this man was here, not because of protocol, not because of rules, but because without him, none of this would even exist. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Some shifted in their seats, others froze, their surprise plain. The host pressed on, his words gaining weight with each breath. Years ago, when our first event was on the brink of collapse, when we were short of hands, short of time, and short of faith, he was the one who stepped forward. He worked through nights when others abandoned us. His advice, his persistence, his hands, these carried us through. When the stage nearly fell, it was his strength that held it up. When chaos threatened to destroy us, it was his steadiness that brought order. Tonight we stand on ground that was saved by him. I felt the words pierce the air, like light breaking through a shuttered window. All the whispers I had endured, the not important, the weight outside, crumbled against the weight of truth spoken aloud for all to hear. Facts were not arguments, they were fire, and now that fire burned bright in the hall, impossible to extinguish. The host continued, his voice unyielding. It is easy to look at an old man and think he is only a shadow, only a relic. But this man is not a shadow. He is the reason there is a stage, the reason there is a tradition, the reason we can gather tonight. I would not hold this microphone if not for him, and that is why we did not begin without him. The hall was silent, stunned, every word pressing deeper into their hearts. Students stared wide-eyed, parents looked uneasy, teachers nodded with slow realization. And among them, I saw the faces that had turned away from me in the lobby, now flushed, now restless, now unable to deny what they had so easily dismissed. The facts spoke louder than shame. The truth illuminated every corner of the hall, leaving no space for whispers, no shelter for lies. I sat quietly in the first row, not raising my head too high, not gloating, but letting the truth wash over me like a tide long delayed. For the first time in years, my silence was no longer mistaken for emptiness. It was a throne. And in that silence I felt justice arrive, not in thunder, not in vengeance, but in the simple, undeniable power of truth, spoken into a microphone, carried to ears that could never unhear it. I did not rise. I did not take the microphone. I did not turn to the crowd with words I had rehearsed 100 times in the silence of my own mind. I remained seated in the front row, the plaque of my existence no longer hidden in dust but alive in the presence of the host's voice. My hands rested on the handle of my cane, my gaze steady, and I let the silence speak for me. And it did. The silence that once marked me as invisible now worked like fire. It was not weakness anymore, it was witness. Each second that I sat without defending myself, the weight of truth pressed harder on every person in the room. My stillness said what words could not. I have nothing to prove. You are the ones who must reckon with what you chose not to see. I felt their eyes on me, hundreds of them. At first there was unease. Faces shifted uncomfortably, hands fidgeted in laps. Children whispered to parents asking questions no one wanted to answer. But slowly, something began to change. That unease gave way to a new expression, recognition. A dawning awareness that the man they had overlooked, the man they had left waiting in the cold, was not the weak shadow they imagined, but the foundation they had walked on without thanks. I saw it in the teacher's eyes, the subtle nods, the way their posture straightened as they recalled moments from long ago, perhaps realizing my name was not new to them, but one they had encountered before and never honored enough. I saw it in the parents' faces, guilt softening into respect, the dawning humility of realizing they had clapped for the wrong people for far too long. And I saw it most of all in the children, the students who looked at me with curiosity, their youthful eyes wide, as though they were witnessing a story unfold before them that would stay longer than any lesson. But nothing pierced me deeper than the sight of those who had betrayed me in the lobby. The usher who had dismissed me as not important stood stiff near the door, his face pale, his lips pressed thin with shame. The friend who had walked past me with downcast eyes now sat just a few rows behind, his gaze locked on me, his silence heavy, but no longer cowardly. It was repentance without words. And then, as though fate itself had turned the spotlight, my eyes found the one face that mattered most, my grandson. His posture had shifted, no longer leaning lazily in his chair, no longer smirking with indifference. He sat upright, frozen, his eyes locked on me. There was confusion in them, yes, but also something new, something raw, something vulnerable. He was seeing me, truly seeing me, as he never had before. I did not need to stand and remind him of all the years, all the sacrifices, all the unseen labor. My silence did it for me. The host's words had already carved the truth into the air. My stillness gave it shape. In the weight of that silence, every dismissive word, every mocking glance, every moment of betrayal was undone. Justice had arrived, not in thunder, not in argument, not in shouting. It had arrived in a chair in the front row, in the silence of a man who no longer needed to defend himself, because truth had already done it. And in that silence, the hall bowed, not in ceremony, not in formality, but in the quiet, undeniable shift of respect. The administrator approached me slowly, his steps measured, his face flushed with the shame of someone who has realized too late the weight of his actions. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned toward me, whispering words that cracked in his throat. It was an apology, awkward, broken, but real. He spoke of misunderstanding, of rules, of procedures, but I heard the truth buried beneath all of it. We failed you. We forgot who you were. We treated you as less than you deserved. I did not answer. I did not need to. My silence pressed heavier than any rebuke could. He knew. The ushers knew. Everyone knew. The air itself was thick with the knowledge of what had been done. And then he gestured to the chair in the front row, a single seat directly beneath the lights, the kind of place reserved not for the forgotten, but for the honored. I lowered myself into it slowly, my cane steadying me as if to mark the moment with ceremony. To anyone else, it was just a chair, wood polished, cushion plain, but to me, it was something more. It was not simply furniture. It was a restoration. It was my name, returned to me. When I sat down, the hall seemed to exhale. The murmurs softened. The tension eased. The restless shifting stilled. The host stepped forward again, and the stage that had been waiting, the lights that had been straining, the voices that had been caught in uneasy silence, all of it came alive only after I had taken my place. The ceremony had been locked in pause, incomplete without me. And now, with me seated in the front row, it breathed again. The irony struck me sharply. Minutes earlier, I had been told there was no space for me, no seat, no room. And now, the entire hall moved forward, only because I occupied the very place of honor. My presence was not an inconvenience. It was the missing piece. The hall itself bore witness to the truth. Until dignity is restored, until justice is seated,
nothing truly begins.
I felt the stares behind me, the eyes that once turned away now fixed with respect, with guilt, with awe. But I did not turn around. My gaze remained on the stage, calm, steady, unwavering. This moment was not about revenge or pride. It was about dignity reclaimed, about truth finally stepping into its rightful place. The chair creaked gently under my weight, but its sound echoed louder than any speech I could have given. Because in that simple act of sitting down, the story changed. I was no longer the man left outside in the cold. I was the man the hall had waited for. And nothing, not whispers, not betrayal, not silence, could ever erase that again. When the evening finally drew to its close, applause fading into echoes and voices softening into farewells, I remained seated in the front row for a moment longer. The hall had returned to its rhythm, people standing, shaking hands, gathering their coats, but for me, the weight of what had happened lingered heavier than anything that had been said on stage. The ceremony had been about many things, but for me, it became about one truth. Dignity, once stripped away, can be restored, and once restored, it cannot easily be taken again. I rose slowly, the wood of my cane pressing against the polished floor, and turned toward the doors that had once shut me out. How different they looked now. Only hours before they had been a wall, a verdict, a wound carved into wood and hinges. But now they stood open, their golden handles gleaming, their path unblocked, as though even they had bowed to what the night had revealed. People moved through them freely, and yet each glance toward me was different than before. No one dared look past me. No one dared avert their eyes. Respect had replaced avoidance. Acknowledgement had replaced dismissal. The ushers, who had once guarded those doors like sentinels of exclusion, now stood aside with lowered heads. They did not need to speak. Their silence told the story. They had learned what they had tried to deny, that the power to welcome or reject does not belong to them, nor to their rules, nor to their bracelets. True worth cannot be reduced to a list, a plastic band, or a regulation. Worth lives in what has been built, in what has been given, in the quiet sacrifices that hold up the walls others take for granted. And the host, he remained by the stage, his eyes following me as I made my way toward the exit. He did not speak again, but he nodded once, firmly, as if to say, "This is how it will be remembered. This is how it will remain." That nod carried more weight than any public declaration. It was a seal on the night, a promise that this door would never again close in my face. As I stepped through, the cold air of the lobby no longer felt like exile. It was simply air, sharp but honest, no longer an enemy pressing against my chest. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was moving out of the light and into shadows. I was carrying the light with me. Because the truth, once revealed, does not return to silence. The evening ended, yes, but the order of things had changed. They had told me once to wait outside. They had treated me as invisible, unimportant, a man whose name could be brushed away with the wave of a hand. But now, after this night, no one would dare. My place had been carved not just in a chair, not just in a hall, but in memory, in their eyes, in their whispers, in their shame, and in their newfound respect. That door, which had once closed on me like a wound, had become something else. It had become a symbol, a threshold that once said, "You do not belong," now stood as a reminder that the truth cannot be shut out forever. And every time it opened after that night, it carried with it my story. The legacy of that evening was not applause, not recognition, not even honor. It was something greater. It was the quiet certainty that the injustice of being cast aside had been overturned, that a seat in the front row had restored more than dignity. It had restored belonging. And I knew as I walked away that the door once closed against me had not just been opened for a night. It had been opened forever.